Do you ever struggle with knowing how much is enough photo editing and how much is too much? Do you know when you've gone too far or what that even means or looks like? Well, if you ask yourself those questions, stick around because in this video, you're going to learn about the 7 deadly photo editing sins that are telltale signs that you've overdone it. And I'll show you how to avoid making those mistakes. Hi, I'm Darlene with Digital Photo Mentor. I teach beginning and intermediate photographers like you how to improve your photos right from capture in camera all the way through to the end of the editing process. So if you're ready to see the 7 deadly sins of photo editing, let's get started. Number 1 photo editing sin is pulling the shadows and the highlight sliders way too far. Let me show you what it should look like and what not to do. This is an image that I've already done some editing on. The before image is a little bit flat and the colors are washed out. And the inclination of many beginners especially is to eliminate the shadows and to tone down the highlights to minimize contrast. But what that does is it actually makes the image seem flat, and if you go too far and go over the top, you end up with something that looks like this. Now when you look at it, the area here of the rocky shoreline is almost the same tone as the bright highlights. The image lacks depth and punch because of the lack of contrast. So when you have an image like this with shadows, don't try to eliminate them, just lighten or soften and don't go too far. It's the shadows in your image that help the bright parts, like the buildings in this image, stand out so the viewer knows what to look at. Number 2, deadly photo editing sin is not having any pure black or pure white in your image. This goes right along with point number 1. When you overdo it with the shadows and the highlights and you eliminate blacks and whites, you end up with something that's very flat, like the image you see now. Use the histogram in your photo editing software. This is Lightroom, but it works the same in Luminar, On1, or any other software that you may be using to edit your photos. What you're looking for is, does the graph touch the edge on the right, meaning there's pure white, and on the left, meaning there's pure black? In this particular case, the image is very flat. The original was very contrasty. It was actually a bracketed series of images formed into an HDR. So there's a lot of detail that was pulled out. But now it's gone too far with the editing and the image is actually flat or lacking contrast. So this is an example of what not to do. To solve that problem, use the histogram again and make sure that you use the tools in your editing software to make sure that you have some pure white. That's what I'm doing here to check the whites, and that you actually have some blacks clipping or lack of detail in the black areas, which will give you more color in your image as well. So before you jump over to that saturation slider, make sure that you have some nice solid blacks in your image and that you have a little bit of blacks clipping. This is the same before image, but look at how much deeper and richer the colors are and the image looks overall compared to this flatter version. While we're on the topic of saturation, let's talk about number 3 in the photo editing deadly sins, oversaturation. This is another big mistake that I see a lot of beginners making. Try and keep your colors more natural looking and pleasing to the eye. If you look at the before image of this one, this is the unedited version, and you can see that the sky is a little bit blown out, but by using the tools inside of my photo editing software, in this case Lightroom, I was able to pull out detail and color in the sky. And if you can make note here, I have not touched either of the saturation or the vibrance sliders. So when you have good contrast and some pure black in your image, as I mentioned in the last point, you will have color as well. As a comparison, this is what oversaturation looks like. You can see the saturation slider and the vibrance slider have been used here to increase and punch the color up. Likewise, the HSL panel has been used to darken the sky and to increase the color. To take things even farther of what not to do is increasing the clarity and the texture to the point where you end up with something that looks really grungy and crunchy. A really solid telltale sign that you've over-edited your image is when you start to get halos around things, especially areas like this in the sky. Can you see that the tops of the trees are actually darker than the rest of the trees, and then the very bottom of the sky is lighter than the rest of the sky? If you look hard, you can see almost like there's a glow at the horizon over the top of the hills. This is an indicator of overprocessing. So remember, keep your color more natural looking, try to avoid the vibrance and saturation sliders altogether, and make color that looks more like this. Photo editing sin number 4, over-sharpening. When an image has been over-sharpened, you'll start to see things that look not quite right as well. If we take a closer look at this bird, you can see that there's actually an outline around him. Can you see the halo here? There's a lot of grain. If I zoom in even farther, you can see that the grain is really sharp. The bird himself has lots of noise and is losing the detail in the feathers because of the amount of noise. When you have an image that was shot at a really high ISO, for example, 1000 like this one, and then you add a lot of sharpening, you're actually sharpening the noise. So it becomes an even bigger problem. Over-sharpening can be done with clarity and the texture sliders, as well as in the detail panel in Lightroom or the sharpening tool in your software. Also, consider sharpening just part of the image, in this case, the bird, and not the background. Look at the difference. In this version, the clarity and the texture overall, as in the global edits to the entire image, is much lower. When we zoom into the bird, he's still been sharpened. If we do a before, you can see there is indeed sharpening, but it hasn't gone to the point of increasing the amount of noise. So you have to find a happy balance between increasing the sharpness to improve the overall image look and focus and getting too much noise. That brings me to point number 5, overdoing the noise reduction or not doing enough. In this example of this portrait, she's been over-sharpened just like the bird. This is not an attractive look for people because when we zoom in, you could see that it has enhanced every little tiny crevice and imperfection in her skin. If we try to then compensate by doing extra heavy noise reduction, you start to get some weird things like this, which are called artifacts. See how the pixels actually start to look swirly? This is an example of over-sharpening and overdoing the noise reduction. These artifacts, or the little squiggly lines you see here, like this, is another telltale sign of over-editing. If I take this one to further extremes, doing the other sins, such as pulling the highlights and the shadows much farther, no blacks and no whites, you see how odd it starts to look? Let me show you what this image should look like, edited properly. Whenever you're editing an image of a person, whether that's a portrait or a candid, keep the clarity or the sharpening a little bit on the lower side. Likewise, use the tools in Lightroom, if that's your photo editor, use the masking slider to keep it off of the skin. If you hold the Alt-Option key down, you'll see where the sharpening is applying. With no masking, it sharpens the whole image. When you use full masking up higher, it sharpens just the edges. Notice how mostly the skin isn't being affected. See the big difference here? Over-edited, all the sins being made, highlights and shadow slider have gone too far, there's no good solid black, too much sharpening, too much noise reduction, which brings me to number 6, over-vignetting. If I want to add a vignette to this image to darken the edges, something you want to avoid is making your vignette super obvious, like this. If you can see the vignette, then it's overdone. Compared to the good edit, watch what the vignette is doing here if I toggle it off. It's just very subtly darkening the edges to bring your eye into the center to her. Let's look at another example that will be really obvious for over-vignetting. This first one is a good vignette. When I turn it off, you could see that it's just softly darkening the edges. This is a bad vignette. This one was actually done using a mask like this on the sky to highlight the bird. But it's been overdone because it's too dark and it's not feathered enough, meaning it doesn't gradate softly from one edge to the other. To fix it, you just need to soften the edge and soften the effect. Before I tell you number 7, I want to show you just how a few of these things come together. This is the original unedited image of a car in Old Havana. This version has been over-edited. It's overly saturated, overly sharp, including the background, and the subject doesn't stand out. When you look at the image upside down, there's no clear subject for you to look at. If you want to learn more about my upside down trick, watch the video in the description area below after this one. So keep in mind, the goal of photo editing is to get the subject to stand out. So in my final version, I've done just that. I've actually softened and minimized the background, softened and minimized the contrast around the car, and just left this patch of light on the building and the car with full color so the eyes are drawn directly to the old car. And finally, number 7, photo editing deadly sin is not doing any photo editing at all. Modern cameras are miraculous pieces of technology that do amazing things, but they're not perfect. They also can't interpret what you want to capture in a scene and how you want to represent it. Let me show you a few examples of what can't be done in camera. Here's the before image of this cactus. Using photo editing, I was able to tone down the background and punch up the color in the cactus. This is not something you can do with the camera alone. The same applies with this image of the colorful parrot. His colors were rather dull and the background was too bright. So using photo editing, I was able to reverse that and make him stand out more. Have you ever captured a dramatic sunset only to get back to the computer and look at it and it's blah like this one? Not to worry, photo editing to the rescue. This is a single image, not HDR. That is what's possible with a RAW file as well. So make sure that you're also shooting RAW. As well as solving exposure and contrast issues that you can't fix in the camera, you can also add style to your image with photo editing. For example, like this one. This is actually a black and white image with dual color grading or duotone. For me, it really represents this scene as I envisioned it. Similarly, with this image of a chocolate shop in Paris, I really wanted an old world kind of feel to it, and through photo editing, I was able to bring that to life. I briefly mentioned HDR. Well, this is a 4-image bracketed HDR combined into one, and here is the after. Once again, you can't capture this much dynamic range and tones in a single image sometimes. So use all the techniques that are available to you, including photo editing and HDR. And finally, without photo editing, you wouldn't be able to do things like stitch a panorama. Here's the final image of the 5 frames that I took, now stitched into one final panoramic image. I have one final bonus tip for you. If you are adjusting the sky in your image and you want to make sure you don't go too far, look for something called banding. When we look at this image here closer up, you can see that it's not gradually blending anymore. There's streaks across the sky, and that's not the clouds. Can you see here? There's a dark line across the middle. And over here, there's some odd streaks as well. That's called banding. When you get this happening in your image, it means that the software can't render the tones smoothly anymore because you've tried to push them too far. Again, this is another key factor of what to look for in terms of over-editing. If you want to learn more about editing your images and knowing where to start, watch this video now on my upside down trick. If you want to learn more about using Lightroom in particular, check out Lightroom for Photographers, my complete course now. So please stay away from these 7 deadly sins of photo editing, and I'll see you next time.